Well, welcome everybody. For today's Bijou conversation, I'm delighted to welcome Malcolm Crompton, who's one of the leading privacy voices in Australia. So from down under, Malcolm, welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. So I'm Malcolm Crompton. I was the Privacy Commissioner for Australia from 1999 to 2004. And so my term just overlapped with Richard's when he began his term. I've been running a privacy consultancy ever since that, as you would expect, just continues to be more and more successful as everybody begins to take the issues more seriously.
Well, that's certainly true. Malcolm, you've seen a bit about our Project Bijou in Guernsey, which is all about telling stories and trying to spread the word about privacy. And some of the stories are good, some are not so good. Could you, from Australia, tell us a story where things have gone rather badly wrong in your view, where data has not been handled very well?
Unfortunately, Richard, we have quite a number of those stories to tell. So I've chosen one that's most particularly egregious. Our governments have got more and more careful about paying out benefits of any sort, pension benefits, unemployment benefits, disability benefits, all those sorts of things. And so they're always looking for fraud under every rock. So they've always been following up on potentially fraudulent overclaims. But a few years ago, they decided to automate it. So in the process of automating, they literally wrote the computer program wrongly. In other words, the computer program didn't follow the requirements of the law, essentially averaging income rather than measuring income week by week by week, because that gives you a different and lower result. Notwithstanding the fact that what they were doing was running a program that created debt levels illegally, they then used the process to send out debt letters to the people owing the money that were frankly threatening, basically running a guilty until proven innocent process, saying, you have this debt, unless you can prove you haven't got this debt, we will come and collect the debt. Now, this is often sent to people who are not exactly very good at keeping records, unemployed, marginally attached to society. They will have been doing work where pay would have been poorly documented. So essentially, we're dealing with the targets for the debt recovery are poor record keepers who've been employed by poor record keepers, who have to therefore provide evidence that doesn't exist to prove that the government's claims, which were illegally created, should not be collected. It turned into a massive political debacle for the government, and they kept on fighting it in the courts on a regular basis until finally the courts ruled this was illegal. So it's a classic case of taking a certain amount of information and not enough information, handling it wrongly, and then using it in a very vicious way to collect debts. So it's based on misuse of information. So that's one of my examples for you, Richard.
Well, that sounds a very nasty story. I mean, especially as you say, it hits the most vulnerable members of the community and often at their weakest. Well, let's not be too miserable. Are there some good news stories? Have there been examples where efforts have been made to safeguard people's information and make sure that the information is kept as private as possible? What's been the Australian experience of trying to get things right?
I've got two different sorts of examples for you, Richard. Because Australia is a federation, we have both the federal government and the state governments. And amusingly, during this COVID crisis, the state governments have proved how weak the federated arrangements are, and in fact, the federal government doesn't have very much power at all. That notwithstanding, the federal government basically bought off Singapore an app that would allow two mobile devices to tell each other that they were in close proximity with each other for a limited length of time. And if that information was ever needed, it could be drawn down. So quite different, I think, from some of the kind of apps, phone apps that have been created, say, in Britain, and certainly different from the Google Apple one. However, the bit that I want to draw attention to is the extraordinary piece of law that was passed to protect that data. Very simple piece of legislation that literally said all collection, all use, all sharing of this data by anybody, anywhere in the world, any sort of institution, public or private, policing or national security, is illegal. Full stop. There are two exceptions. One exception is the use by contact tracers in state departments of health to do contact tracing. And the other is generation of statistics about that. That's it. Then there are other provisions in the law that says anybody who forces the use of the app before you can enter premises basically goes to jail. And so it made coercive use of the app illegal and did a number of other things that provided protection, which is effective simply because it's of simplicity. There were no exceptions. There were no soft example statements. It was very clear.
Mm.
So that's my example about
Well,
getting
if I can just cut in there, I mean, that seems an extraordinarily powerful piece of protection there, which perhaps others might learn from. I mean, the whole collection of data about COVID has been a hugely controversial matter. It continues with debates about passporting and so on. But I think the story there illustrates it's not so much the collection of data, it's the sharing the use of the data that's really, really important. I mean, you obviously want to minimize data in the first place, but in a pandemic crisis, you understand the need to collect as much as possible about people's movements, but how it's used is really, really important. Sorry, I interrupted, Malcolm. You're going to give another example, I think, of
I was
people
just going to
trying
say
to get it right.
On that example, I've only given some of the elements of the construct. You know, there is a collection limitation process, and there's a data destruction process, and a whole bunch of other surrounding protections in the law that are quite remarkable. And I have described it publicly in radio broadcasts and things as the strongest piece of privacy law ever passed anywhere in the world. It really is extraordinary. The other example I was going to give is, I'm not quite sure if it's gone this way in Britain or not, but some of the states passed things called public health orders under their public health legislation. It basically said before you can enter premises, you've got to sign a document that says you were here, here's your name, here's your phone number, and that record has to be kept and then passed into government if needed for contact tracing. So that slowed things down, everybody queuing up to sign a book, get in. That was quickly replaced by private sector QR codes provided by both for-profit and not-for-profit app providers, so that you could show your QR code, collect your QR code and go in much more quickly. But it turned out that those were often subterfuges for collecting much more information than the government needed and using it for purposes that the government hadn't prescribed, like, hey, welcome to our restaurant. We noticed you were here last week. We noticed you had a steak. We've got a great steak special on this week. Oh, by the way, please bring your QR code reader again. So particularly the government of New South Wales, which I think has got going digital, going really well under a quite extraordinary minister called Victor Dominello, Minister for Customer Service, and he's actually on about service. He's making it work through digital. He said, we're going to build within the Service New South Wales, a state government agency, the QR code app. And that was built very rapidly using agile techniques. And I'm a great skeptic of agile techniques, but these ones worked to build a minimal viable product, to build out extra capability. And then he literally, after it was working properly, banned the use of all the other QR codes. And that is surrounded by privacy by design, and I've been fortunate enough to be involved in the privacy by design process. So they had separated process, privacy by design during design and build, then separate privacy impact assessments by another independent party. There's things there like this data is kept for 28 days, stored securely, deleted after 28 days unless called for contact tracing. There's just only 4 data fields collected: name, contact of email or phone, where you were when you were there. Very simple, data deleted very rapidly. And that in a way is a technical protection because it's actually got not very strong legal protection. It's quite interesting. So basically the protection there is the word of mouth of the minister, which in that instance is actually quite trustworthy. So that's a bit unusual. Sorry, but I do compliment Victor Dominello. I think he's been very impressive. So there you go, 3 different examples illustrating 3 different things.
Well, Malcolm, I mean, very good. That last example is sort of illustrating the importance of data minimization, keeping the minimum amount, maximum amount, as it were, you need for a particular purpose, but also privacy by design, a fairly new sort of idea, but you obviously been advising the government to the New South Wales government to adopt that approach. But you do need a true leader who understands the importance, because in Bijou, we're trying to sort of really talk about culture and behavior. It's not just what's written in the law books, it's how people behave in practice. You need people with the vision to lead that. Malcolm, fascinating stuff. Guernsey is somewhat smaller in Australia. We're 27 square miles compared to your millions. But interesting how the same sorts of issues, the same sort of problems are rising anywhere around the world, frankly. And I'm also interested, all three of your examples involve government or governmental use of data. And of course, governments have got much stronger powers to collect and enforce the collection of data. And therefore, in my view, one's got to watch very closely how government handles data, in some ways more than the private sector, where you've got the forces of competition, which act as a constraining influence. But all your examples, they're great, Malcolm. Thank you very much indeed. We'll make sure they are passed around the bailiwick of Guernsey, and we hope to get people talking and perhaps learning from Australia. And maybe one day Australia will learn also a bit from Guernsey. So Malcolm Crompton, thank you very much indeed.
And thank you for inviting me into your conversation, Richard, and all the best with the whole of the Bijou project.